Hello everyone, Board Observer here. I wanted to continue the dialogue of privilege and oppression and how that plays out in greater society. If you missed my earlier video, I recommend it. It's a bit long, but I think it's pivotal that we all get on the same page when I speak about this topic. Having said that, privilege, whether we want to admit it or not, exists. When it's weaponized through the contemporary version of social justice, it becomes toxic. As stated in my earlier video, the social justice that's promulgated today has many roots entrenched in Marxism and postmodernism. This can be summed up in a social theory called conflict theory. This theory is a distilled version of Marxism, which is an economic philosophy of rich versus poor. Conflict theory is simply replacing rich versus poor with oppressor versus oppressed. Critical race theory is whiteness versus people of color. Feminist theory is men versus women.
This is crazy. I mean, do you even know what it's like to be a woman in this country where you can't get ahead no matter what you do?
Oh, jeez, I don't know. Let me put my thinking cap on that one. I'll get back.
Queer theory is heteronormativity versus every other sexual or gender expression. Intersectionality is a social theory that says that any given person could, at one time, encompass several different identities. These identities play on one another, and the more an individual possesses historically oppressed identities, the less privilege they possess. On the flip side, the more historically oppressed identities one has, the more moral authority is granted to this person. If you are, say, a cis, white, straight, rich male, you are at the bottom of the intersectional or oppression hierarchy.
All white people are racist, all men are misogynistic, all cisgender people are transphobic.
If one is cis, rich, white, and a gay male, then they have more moral authority than their straight counterparts. However, it could be said that their wealth could downgrade them back a few points. Another example is a white, lesbian, genderqueer has more moral authority than a white, straight, cisgender woman. However, the white, lesbian, genderqueer has less moral authority than, say, a black, straight female. The cis, straight, melanin deficient male might have all the oppressive power, but people of color generally have more moral authority due to their lack of privilege. Unless the person of color is right of center or libertarian, then they're basically race traitors. The moral absolute in conflict theory and social justice is this: right of center, libertarian, white, cis, straight, rich males are the oppressors, and everyone else are the oppressed. Conflict theory isn't a very high resolution point of view, but if you get it and understand it, you can clearly see how it's used in politics and in social society. Having said that, let's get started. So, in the news, Brett Kavanaugh has been accused of sexual assault when he and his accuser were in their teens. Regardless of your opinion, you can clearly see conflict theory in play and the terminology of social justice being used. There have been several articles and pundits stating that Kavanaugh has to be guilty because he is a white male of power. Brett Kavanaugh might be guilty. Regardless, his skin tone, his privilege, and his gender have condemned him regardless of truth.
They're protecting a man who is probably guilty.
It's the men in this country, and I just want to say to the men in this country, just shut up and step up. Do the right thing.
Through the eyes of conflict theory and the modern version of social justice, Kavanaugh is guilty at worst and suspect at best. Intersectionality affords Kavanaugh no moral authority in the court of public opinion. He's born guilty, and his privilege condemns him. Cis, straight, wealthy white men do have a long history of oppression, but their question remains, is Kavanaugh guilty of the crime he's being accused of? Another example I'll highlight is the one I mentioned in my previous video. I'm just going to assume you didn't watch the entire video. That's okay. A couple of months back, the New York Times hired tech writer Sarah Zhang onto their editorial board. Zhang has a history of tweeting anti-white invective with no repercussions. The excuse assigned to her was the reason she tweeted these things was because she was trolling the alt-right. Be that as it may, Zhang is a person of color. She's Korean and a female. She holds far less privilege than her straight, white, cis male counterparts. However, she did graduate from Berkeley and Harvard Law School. Critical theory and contemporary social justice theory are more often than not immune to logic. So, despite Zhang being a member of the Harvard elite, she was afforded the moral authority that her intersectionality provided. Therefore, she suffers no consequences. Now, flipping the scales of oppression, conservative activist Candace Owens copied and pasted Zhang's tweets But instead of white, she entered Jewish or other races. She was promptly suspended from Twitter for a short period of time. So, your turn. Candace Owens is black, straight, cis. How much moral authority does her intersectionality afford her? A lot? Perhaps it should. Black women in America have a history of oppression that most people could never understand. On the surface, surely a black female has faced more systemic oppression than a Korean Harvard Law graduate. But, as I stated earlier, no matter how many systemic oppressed identities one possesses, what factor do you think trumps all of that and places that person in the oppressor category? You guessed it. Conservative, Republican, or libertarian ideology, or what Marxists call neoliberals. Also, mentioned in the last video, neoliberalism and the values of the Enlightenment are tools of the oppressive, white, cis-straight, rich patriarchy. These social theories are what gives immunity to someone like, say, the late Ted Kennedy, and at the same time condemns Justice Clarence Thomas. For those who aren't aware of Kennedy's greatest hits, back in the day, he literally drove off a bridge and abandoned a girl who was in the back seat to suffocate at the bottom of a creek. Though he is straight, cis, white, and super wealthy, his political ideology is left of center. And he's a Kennedy. Being a Kennedy is one of the few things that actually trumps straight, white, cis males. Ironically, straight, white, cis male senators tried to pit Anita Hill against then candidate to the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas. How could these straight, white, cis male senators do this with a straight face? Justice Thomas is black, yes, but his political ideology is conservative. Based on conflict theory and contemporary social justice theory, Justice Thomas is practically a white man. That's all I have for this segment. As the headlines continue to roll in, I'll highlight one or two stories that demonstrate how conflict theory and contemporary social justice theory plays out in these stories. And modern social justice are low-resolution lenses to view the world. If you get this simple formula, you will be able to predict where it will strike next. Until next time, I'm the Board Observer. Word.
Word.